Everyone says time heals all wounds, but at Love and Scars Stories, we know some scars never fade. They transform. Today's story is about a pregnant widow and a broken cowboy, where grief became strength and loss turned into a second chance. Out on a forgotten western ranch, everything began with one small decision: to trust a stranger. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In the far reaches of Montana, where the land remembers every loss and silence stretches longer than hope, lives sometimes change hands in the most unlikely ways. Elowandre never believed her future would hinge on a single bid at a work-for-shelter auction held in the dust-choked yard of Willow Ridge. She was a widow carrying new life inside her, fighting to keep a dying ranch from slipping through her fingers, ready to risk her last dollars on any man strong enough to set right what time and hardship had torn apart. Cale Rook looked like a man already spent, another war-worn drifter with hollow eyes, scarred hands, and a stillness that spoke of battles long past. Yet beneath that guarded quiet lived a will that had not fully given up. As fall settled over the valley in shades of amber and gold, and Elowand's child drew closer to entering the world, she would come to learn that fate often delivers its answers wrapped in forms no one expects. Still, the secrets both she and Cale carried cast long shadows, and the question lingered whether those hidden truths would shatter what little hope had begun to grow between them before it could take root. Morning fog draped the rolling hills of Willow Ridge Valley like a slow, forgiving breath, dulling the sharp lines of drought-cracked soil and leaning fence posts. Elowandre stood on the wide porch of the ranch house that had once belonged to her husband, one hand pressed to her aching lower back, the other resting protectively over the swell of her belly, where the child stirred with quiet insistence. 7 months along, and every step reminded her how much her body had already given. She felt each passing week in her bones, in the way her balance shifted, in the careful patience now required for even the simplest movements. Behind her, the old rocking chair groaned softly in the breeze, its sound both familiar and heavy with memory. Orland Dre had shaped that chair from Montana pine during their first winter together, his hands steady and gentle, the same hands that had taught her to ride fence lines, brand cattle, and understand the land as something living rather than owned. Now the chair sat unused, a silent marker of promises cut short. Elowand shifted her stance as the baby kicked against her ribs and looked out across the property that had carried the Dre name for 3 generations. The farmhouse, its paint peeling and shutters sagging, stood watch over acres of pasture left thin and tired. Fences that once held firm now drooped between rotting posts, wide enough for cattle to slip through, if there were any cattle left to slip away. The barn told its own story. Its red boards had dulled to the dark stain of old blood, and broken roof tiles lay scattered in the grass below, casualties of a hailstorm she never had the money to repair. Orleen had been gone 8 months. A sudden heart attack took him while he was repairing the water pump near the creek, leaving no warning and no time for goodbye. 8 months of Elowand trying to hold together what generations of hard work had built. 8 months of watching debt close in, creditors arriving with clipped voices and folded papers, each visit threatening to strip away the last place she belonged. The child kicked again, harder this time, and Elowand placed both hands over her belly, lowering her voice instinctively. "I know," she murmured. "It's getting tight in there. It won't be long now." Doc Thayer Holt had said early October, giving her barely 6 weeks to figure out how a woman alone, with a newborn, could manage a 1,000-acre ranch already failing under her care. The screen door creaked behind her, and Fenna Crow's voice carried out with its familiar mix of warmth and command. Elowen, get back inside and finish your breakfast. That baby needs real nourishment. And standing out here worrying won't fix a single fence. Fenna had been Orlean's aunt, though she was only a handful of years older than Elowen herself. She had arrived the morning after the funeral without asking, suitcases in hand and a casserole meant to last a week, but gone in 3 days. And she had never left. Elowen remained where she was a moment longer, breathing in the damp morning air, knowing that somewhere beyond those hills waited a choice that could either save her life or end what little she had left. 8 months had passed, and Fenna Crow showed no sign of packing her bags, a fact Elowen was grateful for in ways she never quite found the words to express. "I'm coming," Elowen called back, taking one last look at the valley spread out before her, brushed in gold and amber by the rising sun. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills, as the fog thinned and lifted, sat the town of Willow Ridge, and with it, the weekly work-for-shelter auction that stood as her final, fragile hope. Inside the house, the kitchen still carried the warmth of baking. The biscuits Fenna had pulled from the oven earlier rested cooling on the counter beside a jar of blackberry preserves, dark and glossy, made from fruit picked along the creek. That room had always been the heart of the house. Wide plank floors smoothed by generations of boots. Cabinets shaped from local timber by Orlin Dre's grandfather. Sunlight poured through the broad windows overlooking the garden, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Fenna stood at the stove, her gray hair twisted into the same practical bun she had worn for as long as Elowen could remember. The apron tied at her waist hung over a body thickened by years. Yet she still moved with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her life caring for others. She turned as Elowen entered, blue eyes sharp with concern, earned from watching someone she loved battle impossible odds. "Sit," Fenna said, pointing to the chair at the head of the table. Orlin's chair, the one that faced both the yard and the pasture beyond. "And don't start telling me you're not hungry. That baby needs protein, and you need strength for what's ahead." Elowen eased herself down, accepting the plate of eggs and bacon Fenna set in front of her. The food was cooked just right, as always, yet it tasted like nothing at all. Still, Elowen forced herself to eat, knowing Fenna would not let her leave a single bite untouched. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Fenna began, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee gone cold from neglect. "About the auction." The word lingered between them, heavy as a spoken failure. Every Saturday, the town gathered for what they politely called a work-for-shelter auction, though everyone knew it was a place where desperation was traded for a roof and meals. Mostly men stood on the block, though now and then women appeared too, all wearing the same hollow look of people who had reached the end of their choices. "I know what you're thinking," Elowen said, nudging the eggs around her plate. "That it's reckless for a pregnant woman to bring a stranger into her home, especially one desperate enough to sell his labor for room and board." Fenna wrapped her weathered hands around her cup and studied Elowen with the unflinching gaze of someone who had watched 60 years of wise decisions and costly mistakes. "What I'm thinking," she said slowly, "is that you're too proud for your own good, too stubborn to ask for help when you need it most. But I also know you're smart enough to tell the difference between a careful gamble and walking straight off a cliff." "The bank's given me until the end of October," Elowen said quietly, the words falling somewhere between a prayer and a curse. "If I can't pay by then, they take the ranch. I owe $18,000, Fenna." 18,000. The number settled like a weight in the room. She didn't have $18, let alone 18,000. The silence that followed was thick with arithmetic that offered no mercy. Fenna had already sold her small place in town to cover funeral costs and the worst of the debts. But it had been like pouring water into a bucket with the bottom knocked clean through. The money had vanished into a bottomless pit of late fees, penalties, and compounding interest, debts that had grown unchecked during Orlean Dre's final months, when hospital bills came before everything else. How much could you actually afford to pay someone? Fenna Crow asked at last, her voice steady, always angled toward solutions instead of despair. Elowen set her fork aside and leaned back, one hand drifting to her belly where the baby had finally settled. "I've got maybe $300 left in the account," she said quietly. "The pantry might last us through winter if we're careful, and there's the house and barn for shelter. It isn't much, but it's what I have." "It's more than some of those men have seen in months," Fenna replied. "And if you found the right one, someone who knows ranch work, he might get this place back on its feet enough to draw a buyer. Even if you can't save it, you wouldn't walk away with nothing." The thought of selling the ranch cut into Elowen like a blade. Yet she had already faced the truth that keeping it might be beyond reach. What mattered now was buying time, long enough to give birth, to heal, to figure out what came next. A capable ranch hand could mend the worst of it, pull the fences straight, patch the barn roof before winter closed in. It wouldn't be salvation, but it could mean the difference between losing everything and salvaging just enough to start again. "I could offer room, meals, and $50 a month," Elowen said slowly, counting the numbers in her head. "Maybe more if we manage to bring cattle back and turn a profit. But that feels like hoping for rain in a drought." "That's fair," Fenna nodded. "For a man who needs a roof, it's honest pay. You'd be helping him as much as he'd be helping you. Some of those men at the auction are good men, just worn down by bad luck. Veterans mostly," Fenna continued. "Men who came back from the war and couldn't find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The wars seemed to touch everything now. Orlean had been too old to serve, but younger men from the valley had left for places Elowen could barely name. Some returned changed, struggling to fit into a quiet life after learning how to survive chaos. Others never came home at all, leaving behind families who waited for letters that would never arrive. There's a difference between taking a risk and being reckless," Elowen said softly, more to herself than to Fenna. "I'd have to be careful, especially with the baby coming." "Of course you would," Fenna said. "That's why you'd ask questions first. Check references if they've got any. Trust your judgment. You've always had a good sense for people, Elowen." Outside, a meadowlark sang from somewhere in the tall grass, its clear notes cutting through the morning air. The sound wrapped around her like memory of mornings spent in this house with Orlean, planning days and futures, talking about children they hoped for and the life they meant to build. Orlean was gone now. Their future had collapsed into an uncertain present, and the legacy they dreamed of was slipping away bill by unpaid bill. Still, the meadow lark kept singing, and beneath Elowen's heart, the baby continued to grow, strong and stubborn, as if refusing to surrender to the weight of everything that had been lost. Somewhere in town, Elowen believed there had to be a man desperate enough to work for almost nothing. Someone who might help her cling to what little remained of her life for a while longer. "The auction's tomorrow," Fenna Crow said softly. "If you're set on this, we should prepare." Elowen nodded, the decision settling in with the sharp certainty that comes when there is no other road left to take. "Then we will," By Saturday morning, the air in Willowridge carried the smell of dust and strain, mixed with coffee and frying bacon drifting from the diner across the courthouse square. Alawan sat in Fenna's old Ford pickup, her hands folded over the swell of her belly, watching townsfolk gather around the rough platform that served as the auction block. It was nothing more than a handful of wooden boards raised a few feet off the ground. Yet over the years, it had hosted countless exchanges. Livestock sold, farm tools traded, and now these newer, darker transactions, where dignity itself was weighed against survival. The men waiting their turn stood in a loose cluster nearby, clutching their belongings in battered duffel bags or cardboard cases bound with twine. Some were barely more than boys, eyes hollow from growing up too fast in a world with no place for them. Others wore the gray at their temples and the deep lines of men who had once held steady work and solid lives before misfortune stripped it all away. "You don't have to go through with this," Fenna said quietly from the driver's seat, her tone gentle but firm with concern. "We could turn around now, go home, try to think of something else." They both knew there was nothing else. The bank's deadline loomed like a storm building on the horizon, and time was draining away faster than water through a cracked spillway. Elowen pressed her palm against the cool window glass and studied the faces of the men waiting to be claimed by whoever could afford their labor. That was when she noticed him. He stood apart, not drawing attention, yet positioned like someone used to watching rather than being watched. While others shifted nervously or stared at the dirt, he remained motionless. His gray eyes moved calmly across the crowd, with a measured focus that suggested discipline learned far beyond a small Montana town. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean frame of a man shaped by hard work and lean years. His dark hair was cut short in a military style grown slightly loose with time. A heavy mustache shadowed a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. His hands hung relaxed at his sides, scarred and calloused from tools and honest labor. But it was his eyes that held Elowen. Storm-colored, distant, carrying the weight of things most people never had to endure. Pain lived there, tightly controlled, buried deep. Yet beneath it lay something intact. A core of decency that hardship had not managed to erase. "That one," Alawan murmured, nodding toward him. The man standing alone. Fenna followed her gaze and studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Looks capable, carries himself like a soldier. Probably served overseas." Just then, the auctioneer, Rennick Vale, a heavy-set man better known for selling cattle than men, hauled himself onto the platform and raised his hands for silence, his voice soon cutting through the murmurs gathering in the square. Rennick Vale's voice rolled cleanly across the square, practiced and steady despite the ugly purpose of the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got 15 able men looking for honest work today. Room, board, and whatever wages you can manage in exchange for labor. We'll start with young Jimmy Morrison." The auction moved forward with a cold efficiency born of need, not cruelty. Men were brought up one by one. Their skills rattled off like stock records, while bids rose from farmers and ranchers who needed help but couldn't afford regular wages. Some fetched close to $200 a month with room and board. Others barely cleared half that. Alawan watched with a tightening chest, unease creeping in as she wondered if stepping into this place had been a mistake. The whole affair sat too close to something darker than she liked to admit. These men had chosen to stand there, it was true. They needed work, and she needed help. But knowing that did little to ease the weight pressing on her conscience. It was desperation, meeting desperation, not exploitation. Still, it felt wrong all the same. When the tall stranger was finally called, Rennick glanced down at his paper before speaking. Next up, Cale Rook, 32 years old. 2 tours in the Pacific. Experienced with livestock, mechanical repair, and general ranch work. References available. Cale stepped onto the platform with the same quiet restraint he'd shown while waiting. His gaze passed over the crowd without settling anywhere. He said nothing, didn't smile, made no effort to sell himself beyond standing there with a grounded stillness that suggested he could be relied upon. "We'll open at $100 a month, plus room and board," Rennick announced. A few hands lifted, hesitant at first, then firmer as experienced eyes recognized quality. The numbers climbed, 120, 150, 175. Alawan felt her stomach drop as the bids rose past anything she could manage. She had expected it. The best men always cost more. Still, she had hoped, foolishly, that luck might bend her way. At 200, most bidders fell silent, leaving only 2. One was Hollis Brax, owner of the largest spread in the valley, known for driving his men hard but paying fair. The other was a stranger to Elowen, though his polished hat and easy confidence marked him as a man with money to burn. $225, Brax called. $250, the stranger countered. $275. $300. The bidding stalled. Silence stretched as Brax considered his options. $300 was no small sum, enough to hire 2 green hands instead of 1 seasoned one. After a long moment, he shook his head and stepped back. "Going once at 300, Rennick called. "Going twice, $50. Alawan's voice cut through the square, clear and unsteady all at once. The silence that followed was absolute. She could hear the wind threading through the cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle near the stockyards. Every face turned toward her, and heat flooded her cheeks as she realized just how foolish she must sound. $50. When the bidding had climbed to 300, Rennick cleared his throat, clearly thrown. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I believe you may have misheard. The current bid is 300. "The bid is 300, Elowen said, her voice steady as she forced herself upright, easing her pregnant body out of the truck despite the strain. "I heard you just fine. I'm offering $50 a month, room and board, and a share of any profit, if we can get the ranch back in the black." A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, some amused, others quietly sympathetic. The well-dressed stranger who had been bidding against Hollis Brax gave Alawan a sharp, dismissive look, then turned away as if she were no longer worth his time. Up on the platform, Cale Rook's storm-gray eyes met hers and stayed there. For a long, suspended moment, she had the unsettling sense that he saw past the noise and dust, straight through to the truth she carried. "Ma'am," Rennick Vale said gently, "that's a fine offer, but this gentleman has bid 300 in cash." "And when his job's done?" Alawan asked, her gaze never leaving Cale. "Where does he go then?" "I'm offering steady work through the winter, something lasting, not just hired muscle." The stranger scoffed and flicked his hand. $325. "Let's end this." Cale spoke then for the first time, his voice low and rough, carrying a quiet authority that cut through the square. "I'll take the lady's offer." The crowd erupted in startled chatter. Rennick brought his gavel down hard. "Hold on, Cale. You don't get to choose your employer. This is an auction." "The high bid can go to hell," Cale said calmly as he stepped off the platform. "I came to find work, not to be sold like a prize bull. The lady made me an offer I can live with. I'm taking it." The stranger's face flushed red. "You can't do that. I bid fair. You bid on a thing, Cale replied, swinging his duffel over his shoulder. I'm a man. I decide where I work. He crossed the square toward Alowan without another word, never breaking eye contact. Up close, she saw the lines etched by too many sleepless nights, the squared shoulders of a man long used to carrying weight alone. And beneath it, something that looked almost like relief. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. Cale Rook, I believe we've got ourselves an agreement. Elowen looked up at him, aware of the calm that seemed to gather around him despite the chaos. Elowen, Dre, she said. And yes, Mr. Rook, we do. The ride back to the ranch passed in easy silence. Cale choosing the truck bed, duffel at his side, eyes tracking the land with practiced attention. Elowen caught herself watching him in the rear window, noticing how he measured fence lines, buildings, every sag and break like problems already lining up for repair. When they pulled into the yard, Cale was on the ground before Fenna Crow fully stopped the truck. His movements were spare and purposeful. Alowan watched him take in the sagging barn roof, the broken rails, the pastures gone to weeds where cattle once grazed, and felt the familiar sting of how far the place had slipped. It doesn't look like much right now, she said, stepping down with Fenna's steady hand at her elbow. But it used to be something. It could be again. Cale nodded slowly, his gaze moving from the house to the outbuildings and back. Good bones, he said at last. Solid foundations, straight frames. The rest is just work that's been put off too long. There was no judgment in his tone, only the calm, practical evaluation of a man who understood that survival sometimes meant tolerating what ought to have been fixed long ago. Elowen felt the tightness ease in her shoulders at his straightforward acceptance of the ranch's condition. Fenna will show you the bunkhouse, she said. It isn't fancy, but it's clean and dry. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. If work runs late, we'll figure something out. Much obliged, Cale said. He lifted his duffel and followed Fenna toward the small building that had once housed seasonal hands, back when the ranch could afford them. I'll get settled, then take a proper look around, he added, if that works for you. It does, Elowen replied. An hour later, Elowen sat on the front porch when Cale stepped out of the bunkhouse carrying a worn leather tool roll, scarred by years of use, yet carefully kept. He had changed into work clothes, denim trousers and a flannel shirt patched in several places, but clean and solid. His boots were good leather, broken in without being worn thin, the kind meant to last if treated right. Mind if I ask what needs attention first? He said, setting his hat and lifting his eyes to her, steady and assessing. Elowen weighed the question, sorting through a dozen urgent worries. The water pump's been acting up, and winter's coming. If we lose water to the house and barn, we're in trouble. Cale nodded once and headed toward the creek without another word. Alowan watched the way he crossed the uneven ground, sure-footed, alert, moving with the ease of someone accustomed to rough terrain. He walked like a soldier, she realized, carrying that mix of awareness and efficiency learned where mistakes cost dearly. From the porch, she could see him working over the pump housing, his hands moving with practiced confidence as he traced pipes and tested connections. After several minutes, he disappeared into the barn and returned with a wrench and a few spare parts Orla and Dre had once set aside for repairs that never came. The baby kicked sharply, drawing a gasp from Elowen as she pressed her hand to her side. The child had been restless all morning, as if sensing the changes unfolding around them. She rubbed the sore spot and whispered soothing words, unsure whether they were meant more for the baby or for herself. You chose well, Fenna said, stepping onto the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea. He's been down there nearly an hour, and I can already hear the difference. Alawan accepted the glass, realizing Fenna was right. The strained wheeze that had plagued the pump for months had given way to a steady, even rhythm. The sound of machinery finally doing what it was meant to do. He knows his work, Alawan said quietly. More than that, he does it like it matters. Fenna nodded. A man who takes pride in getting things right the first time. That's rarer than folks think. They sat together in easy silence, watching Cale work with focused intensity, lost in the task. When he finally emerged from behind the pump house, his shirt was streaked with grease and his hands dark with grime. But there was a trace of satisfaction in his expression. He walked back toward the house with that same measured stride, stopping at the base of the porch steps to look up at them. The pump's working right now, Cale said. Loose coupling and a clogged intake screen. Keep the housing clear, and it should hold through winter. Thank you, Alawan replied, and meant every word of it. The relief hit her harder than she expected. One heavy worry lifted, and it left her almost unsteady. What do I owe you for the parts? Nothing, he said. They were already here. Just needed fitting. His gaze drifted across the yard, measuring other jobs waiting their turn. If it's all right with you, I'd like to start on the barn roof next. Weather report says rain midweek. Those gaps will only spread if they're left open. Of course, Alawan said. Whatever you think matters most. Cale nodded and turned to go, then hesitated. Reaching into his shirt pocket, he drew out a folded paper, creased soft from being handled too often. Found this while cleaning my gear, he said. Thought you might want to see it. Alawan took it carefully and unfolded it. The photograph was worn and faded, but the image remained clear. A young man in uniform beside a dark-haired woman with kind eyes. Between them stood a little girl, 4 or 5 years old, hair tied in pigtails, smiling wide through a missing tooth. They looked happy, frozen in a moment that felt untouched by time. The man was unmistakably Cale, though younger, lighter somehow. His eyes held a brightness she hadn't seen since he arrived, and his smile carried an ease long since lost. Your family? Alawan asked softly, though the answer had already settled in her chest the instant his face closed off. Yes. The word held a depth of pain that made her throat tighten. Car accident, he continued. 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a light in San Francisco. The plainness of it cut deeper than any long explanation. Alawan's gaze fell back to the little girl's grin, and she instinctively touched her belly, thinking of the child growing beneath her heart. Tears burned behind her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Cale reached for the photograph, and she handed it back without comment. He folded it with care and returned it to his pocket, each movement controlled, precise. Anyway, he said, voice neutral, thought you should know who you hired. Some folks don't like bad luck nearby. Bad luck? Alawan echoed, surprised by the bitterness she heard. Mr. Rook, she said firmly, losing the people you love isn't bad luck. It's tragedy. And it doesn't make you cursed or dangerous or anything else you think it does. Something stirred in his eyes then. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of hope. But it vanished so quickly, she wasn't sure it had been there at all. I'll get started on that roof, he said, and walked toward the barn where ladders and tools waited. By the second week of September, the valley began to feel the first breath of autumn. Mornings turned cool, and the promise of changing leaves lingered in the air. Cale settled into a rhythm that seemed as natural as daylight, sunrise to sundown. His days filled with repairs the ranch had needed for years. He worked steadily, without noise or praise, appearing each morning at first light and retreating to the bunkhouse after supper, leaving progress behind him like quiet proof of purpose. Eloan had grown used to the sounds of him, the steady tap of a hammer, the long draw of a saw, the quiet rhythm of work being done right. Those sounds had been absent from the ranch for far too long. The barn roof no longer leaked. The water pump ran smooth and sure. Half a dozen smaller repairs had been finished with a level of care that spoke to pride, not obligation. But it was the morning she found him seated at the kitchen table, papers spread wide beneath his hands, that she realized Cale Rook was more than a hired ranch hand. "Morning," she said, pausing in the doorway, one hand braced against her lower back, where a constant ache had settled. The baby felt heavier every day now, each movement demanding more thought than it once had. "Morning, ma'am," Cale replied, starting to rise. She waved him back down, a small motion that had become familiar between them. "Fenna said you wouldn't mind if I used the table," he added. "Needed space to lay these out." Eloan stepped closer, unease stirring as she recognized the papers at once. Bank statements, overdue notices, legal forms. The wreckage of her situation, laid bare. "Fenna brought them to me," Cale said evenly. "Thought another set of eyes might help." Heat crept up Eloan's neck. The idea of her private failure exposed to someone she barely knew made her instinctively defensive. But Fenna meant well, and the truth was, Eloan had avoided those papers for weeks, unable to face the certainty they carried. "I suppose there's no point pretending it's anything other than what it is," she said, lowering herself into the chair across from him, "though I don't know what you think you'll see that I haven't." Cale lifted one page, the bank's most recent statement, and studied it closely. His gray eyes moved through the columns with quiet focus, as though numbers spoke a language he understood. "Mind if I ask how it climbed this high?" he said. Eloan exhaled slowly. "Orlin got sick 2 winters ago. What we thought was a bad cold turned into pneumonia that wouldn't clear. Hospital stays, specialists and billings. The bills came faster than we could track." Her voice tightened. "After he died, there were funeral costs, legal fees, taxes we didn't know we owed." She gestured helplessly at the table. "By the time I understood how deep it went, it was already too late. The ranch wasn't earning enough to cover daily expenses, let alone pay down debt." Cale nodded once, fingers tapping the wood in a thoughtful rhythm. "What's the ranch worth if you sold it outright?" "The bank appraised it at $45,000 in the spring," she said, "before the drought worsened, before cattle prices fell." Her shoulders slumped. "Maybe 35 or 40 now, if we're lucky." "And the debt?" $18,000 on the mortgage. Penalties and interest push it closer to 22 by the time they're done." Cale fell silent. He studied the papers with a concentration that made Eloan uneasy, as if he were seeing something she had missed entirely. When he finally looked up, his expression held a quiet intensity that made her heart thud. "What if you didn't have to sell?" he asked. The question cut deep. "Then I'd keep it," she said softly. "But wanting doesn't change numbers, Mr. Rook. I don't have $22,000, and I don't have a way to get it." "Maybe you do," he said. Something in his voice, calm, certain, made her look at him more closely. His hands had gone still on the papers. His eyes held the same sharp focus she'd seen when he tackled a problem others had written off. I don't understand. Cale reached for a pencil, flipped one of the statements over, and began writing. His handwriting was precise and angular, the kind learned by someone used to thinking clearly under pressure. Let me show you something, he said quietly. How many head did this place carry at its peak? Cale asked. About 300, Alawan replied. We sold most to cover bills, and the drought took a good portion of the rest. We're down to maybe 40 now, and half of those aren't worth much. 300, Cale repeated, writing as he spoke. His pencil moved in orderly lines, figures stacking into columns. At current prices, that's close to $70,000 in livestock. Cut 10% for sickness and losses, and you're still looking at $63,000 gross. A short, bitter laugh slipped from Elowin. Mr. Rook, I don't have the money to buy 300 head. I can barely afford feed for what's left. What if you didn't have to buy them? The question lingered between them, sharp as a dare. Alawan leaned forward before she realized it, caught by the calm certainty in his voice. Ranches in the eastern counties are overstocked. Cale continued, pencil never slowing. The drought's worse there than here. They're trying to move animals to better pasture. He looked up. Some would pay to board their cattle through winter, split the weight gain, breeding fees. You provide land and management. They keep ownership. The simplicity of it struck her hard. You think they'd trust their stock to a ranch like this? They'd trust good grass and competent handling, he said. That's what you'd be offering. His gray eyes held hers. The question is whether you're willing to risk what you have left for a chance to save it all. Elowin pressed a hand to her belly as the baby shifted. Her gaze dropped to the wedding band still circling her finger. Orlan's ring. Promises made. A future interrupted. How much risk? She asked quietly. If it works, you keep the ranch and likely make money, Cale said. If it doesn't, you lose what was already slipping away. Just sooner. It was a gamble. But it was also the first real hope she'd felt in months. And across from her sat a man who understood both numbers and consequence. A man who spoke like someone who'd survived worse odds. You'd help me set it up? She asked. Yes, ma'am, if you want me to. Alawan looked again at the ring, the morning light glinting off worn gold, and made her choice. Then let's do it. October arrived on a cold snap. Cottonwoods along the creek blazing gold and amber, their leaves shivering in the sharp air. The ranch began to change. Straight fence posts replaced sagging wire. The barn stood bright with fresh paint, and after months of silence, cattle lowed in the pastures again. Cale's plan worked better than Alawan had dared imagine. 3 ranches from the drought-stricken east agreed to board cattle through winter, swelling the herd to just over 200 head. Healthy animals filled the fields, and their presence transformed the land back into something alive. The empty pastures had come alive again, filled with motion and purpose that reminded Alawan of the ranch in its stronger years. But it was the change in Cale himself that surprised her most. The hard, silent man who had stood on the auction platform weeks earlier was slowly giving way to someone more layered, more fully present. The weight he carried had not disappeared. His grief still clung to him, heavy and constant. Yet now, there were moments when Alawan caught glimpses of who he might have been before loss reshaped him. Those moments came most often in the evenings, after the day's work was done, when they sat together on the front porch and watched the sun sink behind the valley. Fenna had taken to retiring early, blaming fatigue, though her intentions were transparent enough to make Aloan smile to herself. Left alone, Aloan and Cale began to talk. At first their words stayed cautious and shallow. But slowly the conversations deepened as trust took hold. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Aloan first noticed the letters. She had gone inside to fetch a glass of water, moving carefully as the baby's weight pressed against her spine. When she returned, Kyle was holding a small bundle of envelopes tied neatly with string. His gaze lingered on the return address of the top letter, his expression distant. "Sorry," he said, starting to put them away when he realized she was watching. "Didn't mean to bring personal matters onto your porch. You don't need to apologize for having a life beyond this ranch," Aloan said gently, settling into the rocking chair that had become her favorite place at sunset. "And you don't have to share it either, if you'd rather not." Cale was silent for a long moment. The letters rested on his knee like a question he hadn't decided how to answer. In the soft gold of evening, his face showed years of hard weather and harder choices, but also a vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. "They're from Kiva," he said at last. "My sister-in-law, Sabine's sister." The simple words carried a depth Aloan could only imagine. She didn't interrupt, sensing that pressing him would send him retreating behind the walls he relied on to survive. "She writes every month," Cale went on quietly. "Started right after the funeral. News from home, family talk, ordinary things." "Does it help?" Aloan asked. Cale let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "If by help you mean it makes it harder to forget, then yes. It keeps everything close, keeps reminding me what I lost." Aloan rocked gently, the chair creaking in its familiar rhythm. "Maybe forgetting isn't the goal. Maybe not." He turned the bundle of letters in his hands, fingers tracing the careful handwriting. "Kiva thinks I should go back. California. Says the family needs me. Says running out here won't bring them back." "Is that what you're doing?" Aloan asked softly. "Running?" The question lingered between them, sharp and honest. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been wrestling with the same thought for too long. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. All I know is that staying there, living in the house we shared, driving the same streets where it happened, it felt like drowning." He looked out toward the darkening valley. Every corner held a memory. Every familiar place reminded me of what I'd lost. Aloan listened, her hand resting protectively on her belly, understanding more deeply than she cared to admit. Memories surrounded her here. How this ranch still carried Orlean's presence in ways both tender and painful. The rocking chair where he had planned to sit with their children. The barn where he had shown her how to milk a cow, laughing when she fumbled. The bedroom where he had died. All of it woven together into a fabric of love and loss she could not step away from, even if she wanted to. "Sometimes memories are all we have left," Aloan said quietly. "Sometimes they're what keep the people we love alive in us. And sometimes," she hesitated, "sometimes they're what keep us from truly living." The honesty in Cale's face startled her. So did the way he was looking at her, not past her, not through her, but straight at her, as if he were seeing something new. "You think I'm not living?" Aloan asked. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly as the baby shifted. "I think you're trying," Cale said. "But I also think you're afraid to let go of the past enough to step fully into what comes next. The words stung because they rang too close to truth. She did wear Orleans' ring like armor. She did cling to habits and memories that kept him close. And yet, she was planning for the baby, fighting to save the ranch, trusting a stranger with pieces of herself she hadn't meant to give. "Is that what you think you're doing here?" she asked softly. Letting go. Cale didn't answer right away. The silence stretched until she thought he might retreat again. When he finally spoke, there was surprise in his voice, as if the thought had just reached him. "Maybe," he said. "For the first time in 3 years, I'm thinking about what comes next instead of what I lost." Something settled between them then. Fragile, dangerous, and necessary all at once. Elowen really looked at him. The strong line of his jaw, the careful way his hands rested on the letters, the quiet strength that held even when he was exposed. "The baby's coming soon," she said, unsure why she felt the need to say it. "I know," Cale replied. "Everything will change. What we have now, the routine, it won't stay the same." He nodded, his gray eyes steady on hers. "Does that worry you?" Elowen understood the question went deeper than it sounded. Was she afraid of how a newborn would alter the balance between them? Or of the way her heart had begun to react when he smiled? Of how safe she felt when he was near? "I'm worried about plenty of things," she said at last. "But not about you being here when the baby comes. That's the one thing I'm not worried about." The smile that touched Cale's face was small and uncertain, but it changed him completely, bringing light to eyes that had carried too much darkness. "Good," he said, "because I'm not going anywhere." The first snow arrived early that year, dusting the valley in white and turning the familiar land into something new and hushed. Elowen stood at the kitchen window, watching Cale move among the cattle, breaking the thin ice on water troughs, checking each animal with calm authority. Even from a distance, she could see the trust the herd had learned to place in him. 8.5 months pregnant now, Elowen felt the weight of her condition in every breath and movement. The baby had dropped lower, easing the pressure on her ribs while bringing the undeniable sense that birth was close. Very close. Doc Thayer Holt had warned her to stay closer to town this late in the pregnancy. But the ranch didn't recognize warnings. Its needs pressed in like a hand at her back, and no amount of caution could put them off. Cale Rook was capable, more than capable, but even he couldn't shoulder everything alone. "You should be resting," Fenna Crow said, appearing beside her with a cup of tea and the familiar look of disapproval she'd perfected over the last month. "Standing on your feet all day isn't going to make that baby's arrival any easier." "The baby will come when it's ready," Elowen Dre replied, taking the tea with a grateful smile. "And until then, there's work that won't wait." Through the window, she watched Cale pause near the water tank, his body going still in that alert way she'd come to recognize. Something had caught his attention. Even after 2 months, she was still learning the language of his movements, still uncovering the depth of skill and experience hidden beneath his quiet manner. "He's a good man," Fenna said softly, following her gaze. "Better than I expected the day you brought him home from that auction." "He is," Elowen agreed. The words felt too small for what Cale had become to her. A partner in saving the ranch, yes. A steady presence during long evenings when loneliness might have swallowed her whole. And something more. Something she was only just beginning to admit, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. The question, Fenna went on bluntly, is what you plan to do about it. About what? Don't play innocent with me, Elowen Dre. I've seen how you look at him, and more importantly, I've seen how he looks at you. That man is falling in love, whether he admits it or not. And unless I've gone blind, so are you. Heat flooded Elowen's cheeks, part embarrassment, part recognition. Over the past weeks, her feelings for Cale had shifted. Gratitude into friendship. Friendship into something deeper and more dangerous than she'd intended. He was patient with her limits, attentive to her comfort, gentle in ways that stirred a longing she'd believed was buried with Orlin Dre. It isn't that simple, she said at last. Love never is, Fenna replied. That doesn't make it wrong. Before Elowen could answer, boots sounded on the porch, followed by Cale's familiar knock. Fenna opened the door and returned moments later with him, his face set in the controlled urgency that meant real trouble. What is it? Elowen asked, setting her tea aside and moving toward him with the careful, uneven gait her pregnancy demanded. Storm's coming in, Cale said, pulling off his gloves and reaching for the weather radio that lived on the kitchen counter. A bad one. Forecast says up to 2 feet of snow and winds hitting 60 miles an hour. Her stomach tightened, and not just from the baby's movement. A storm like that could cripple the herd, especially the cattle they were boarding for other ranches. Losing animals now wouldn't just cost money. It would shatter her reputation and the fragile future they were building. How long do we have? She asked. 12 hours, maybe 14 if we're lucky. Cale was already shrugging into his coat, movements sharp with practiced urgency. I need to get the cattle into shelter and make sure feed's stored where we can reach it, even if the drifts stack high. I'll help, Elowen said without thinking. Even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were more hope than truth. No, you won't, Cale Rook said, his voice low but immovable, gray eyes locking onto Elowen Dre with an intensity that shut down any argument before it could take shape. You'll stay inside where it's warm and safe. I'll handle what needs doing out there. I can't just sit here while you... Yes, you can. The quiet command in his tone carried the weight of old discipline, that unmistakable edge of military authority that never fully left him. I've handled worse than this, with less help. But I can't do my job if I'm worrying about you and the baby being out in weather that could kill you. The protest Elowen meant to voice dissolved as she heard what lay beneath his words. This wasn't only about caution. He was guarding himself too, against the possibility of losing someone else he cared about. All right, she said at last, her voice soft. But you check in every couple of hours. And if something goes wrong, if it's more than you can handle, you come get me, no matter the risk. Something shifted in Cale's expression. Surprise, perhaps. Gratitude. Or simply the recognition of the trust she was placing in him. I will, he promised. He reached the door, then stopped and turned back. For a heartbeat, she thought he might say more, might name the unspoken pull that had been growing between them for weeks. Instead, he tipped the brim of his hat in that familiar, old-fashioned gesture. Take care of yourself, Elowen. Then he was gone. She stood in the kitchen beside Fenna Crow, the rising wind rattling the windows, the certainty settling deep in her bones that this storm would test more than fences and livestock. It would test the fragile connection between two wounded souls who had found unexpected refuge in each other. Outside, the wind howled harder, leaves skidding across the yard like frightened animals. Somewhere beyond the barn, She heard Cale calling to the cattle, his voice cutting through the cold as he began the dangerous work of moving more than 200 heads toward shelter. Inside her, the baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing the world was tipping toward something unknown. The storm struck with brutal force, turning the valley into a white, screaming wilderness. Elowen sat by the kitchen window, searching the blinding snow for any sign of Cale. Each hour without word tightened the knot in her chest. The cattle were sheltered behind the barn now, but keeping them fed and watered in this weather would demand constant effort. Fenna kept moving, cooking, reheating, keeping herself busy in the way of people who refused to surrender to fear. They spoke little, but their shared worry needed no language. It was close to midnight when boots thudded against the porch. Fenna flung the door open, ushering in a figure so crusted with snow and ice he scarcely looked human. Cale's coat was frozen stiff, his mustache white with frost, his movements precise and controlled, like a man running on sheer will. "Coffee," he said hoarsely. Fenna was already pouring it. Elowen pushed herself to her feet, alarm spiking at the gray cast of his skin and the tremor in his hands as he peeled off his gloves. "The cattle?" she asked. "Secure," Cale said, wrapping his fingers around the steaming mug. "Fed and watered. Enough hay to last through tomorrow if this doesn't ease up." Only then did the tension drain from his shoulders, exhaustion finally claiming its due. 2 head lost to the cold. Cale Rook said quietly, "Given the conditions, that's better than I expected." The losses stung, but they weren't ruinous. 2 animals meant several $100s gone, yet it was nothing compared to what might have happened without Cale's experience and relentless work. Elowen Dre felt some of the iron band around her chest finally loosen. "You need food and rest," Fenna Crow said firmly. "That storm's not finished yet, and if you drop from exhaustion, you won't help anyone." Cale nodded, drained, and reached into his coat for his gloves. As he did, several sheets of paper slipped free and fluttered to the kitchen floor. They weren't receipts or notes. They were legal documents, thick, official, miraculously intact despite the storm. One page landed face up. Elowen caught the letterhead immediately. A California law firm. "Sorry," Cale said, moving to gather them, but not before her eyes snagged on words that made her breath hitch. Her own name, phrases like property transfer and beneficial ownership. "Cale," she said softly. The note in her voice stopped him cold. "What are those?" For a long moment he remained crouched, papers clutched in his hands, his expression shifting through resignation, guilt, and something close to relief. When he finally stood, he met her gaze with the same unflinching honesty she'd come to trust, even when the truth hurt. "Legal papers," he said, "concerning this ranch." The word struck her like a physical blow, though she didn't yet understand why. "What about this ranch?" Cale set the documents on the table with deliberate care, straightening them into a neat stack. When he looked up, his face held the weight of a man who had carried a secret too long. "My real name is Cale Alexander Rook," he began, his voice steady. 3 years ago, I owned the second largest cattle operation in Sonoma County, 15,000 acres, prize stock, a house my family had held for 4 generations. The room seemed to tilt. Elowen felt the blood drain from her face as the meaning of his words sank in. Fenna had gone utterly still, her own expression pale with the same dawning realization. "After the accident," Cale went on, After I lost Sabine and Elka, I couldn't stay. Every fence post, every building, every stretch of ground reminded me of what I'd lost. He swallowed once. So I gave it away. Gave it away? Elowen echoed, her voice barely more than air. To charities, mostly. Some to family who needed help. I kept only enough to survive. He gestured to the papers. These are the final transfers. Everything that remained placed into a trust for struggling ranch families. The quiet man she'd hired for $50 a month had once been one of the wealthiest ranchers in California. The man who had stood on an auction block selling his labor for room and board had chosen to surrender a fortune most people would kill for. You lied to me, Elowen said. Not angry, just stunned. I didn't lie about who I am, Cale replied carefully. I am the man you met at that auction. Someone who lost everything that mattered and was trying to find a reason to keep going. He paused, then added quietly, the money, the land, the name. None of that meant anything once they were gone. That isn't who I am anymore, Cale Rook said. But you could have saved the ranch yourself, Elowen Dre shot back, the full weight of the truth finally crashing over her. You could have paid off the debt, restored everything, turned this place profitable again. Instead, you let me struggle. You let me lie awake at night thinking I might lose everything. Because if you stepped in, it wouldn't really be mine. It would have been mine. Cale cut in, his voice sharp with a force she hadn't heard before. Or the banks, or some strangers who bought it at auction. But it wouldn't have been the land where your husband lived and worked and dreamed. It wouldn't have been your child's inheritance. She stared at him, trying to reconcile the quiet ranch hand she thought she knew with this man who carried both wealth and deliberate restraint, like hidden scars. Then what are these papers? She asked. What does this trust have to do with my ranch? Cale reached for the top document, unfolding it with hands that shook just enough to betray the cost of what he was about to say. This ranch was named the first beneficiary of the fund. As of yesterday, when these papers were filed, your mortgage was paid in full. Elowen's breath caught. The ranch is yours, he continued. Free and clear, along with enough operating capital to keep it running, strong for years. The silence that followed was absolute. She could hear the wind scraping along the eaves, the house settling into itself, the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Inside her, the baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing the storm of emotion threatening to pull her under. You had no right, she whispered at last, tears spilling freely now. She didn't know whether they came from relief, gratitude, betrayal, or all of it tangled together. You had no right to decide that for me. I know, Cale said quietly. I wanted you to save it yourself. You needed to save it yourself. I know that, she said, pressing both hands to her belly as the baby responded to her racing heart. Relief that the ranch was safe warred with anger at being deceived. Gratitude clashed with the sharp ache of broken trust. Beneath it all lay the terrifying certainty that something fundamental between them had shifted. Why? She asked finally. Why give away everything you had? And then give even more to someone you barely knew? Cale was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes holding her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way few people ever had. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something irrevocable. Because you gave me something I thought was gone forever, he said. You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow. He hesitated, gathering the courage for the rest. And because somewhere along the way, you stopped being a stranger. You became the most important thing in my world." The confession hung between them like a narrow bridge, uncertain and untested. Outside, the storm still howled, reshaping the land into something unfamiliar. Much like the future now opening before them, vast and frightening and filled with possibilities neither had dared to name. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a valley buried under 2 feet of pristine snow that glittered in the early sunlight. The world outside looked reborn. Inside the ranch house, the air remained taut, with everything left unsaid. Elowen had barely slept, her thoughts circling endlessly. The ranch was safe, more than safe. It stood on the edge of a prosperity she'd never imagined. Yet the trust she'd built with Cale now felt altered, no longer rooted in shared vulnerability, but reshaped by the knowledge that, all along, he'd been standing on hidden ground. She found Cale Rook in the barn at first light, moving among the cattle with the same steady competence he'd shown since the day he arrived. Yet something in his stance had changed. A guarded weariness, as if he were bracing himself for whatever price honesty demanded. The animals crowded close to him, drawn to the calm assurance of his presence. Watching him, Elowen Dre felt a sharp recognition of how naturally he had taken on the role of protector, provider. "How are the losses?" she asked, picking her way through the snow that had blown in through the gaps in the siding. "Better than we feared," Cale answered, still focused on the trough as he checked for ice. "The 2 we lost were old stock. They likely wouldn't have made it through winter. The rest came through strong." The plain exchange felt oddly out of place after the upheaval of the night before. But Elowen understood the need for routine. Work had always been their common ground, the one place where words weren't required. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said at last, her breath fogging the cold air. "About the trust, about why you set it up." His hands paused, though he didn't turn. "I understand why you did it," she continued, "and why you didn't tell me. But you need to understand what this means for me. For us." Now he faced her. His gray eyes searched her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "What does it mean?" he asked. She stepped closer, close enough to see the fatigue etched around his eyes, the tightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before his confession. "It means I don't know what's real anymore. The man I hired, the partnership we built, the feelings that grew between us, how much of that was genuine, and how much was you playing some quiet game of charity." The words came out sharper than she intended, but they had to be spoken. The doubts had gnawed at her since she'd seen those documents. "None of it was charity," Cale said softly, his voice carrying a certainty that cut through her turmoil. "Every day I worked here, every conversation we had, every moment we shared, that was real. All of it." "Was it?" she pressed. "You could have bought this place 10 times over. You could have hired the best ranch hands in Montana, brought in experts, restored everything without breaking a sweat. Instead, you chose to work beside a desperate, pregnant widow, watching her struggle with problems you could have solved with a single phone call." Cale was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her to the snow-covered pastures where cattle were beginning to emerge, testing the bright new world with cautious steps. When he spoke again, his voice held a depth of pain she was only beginning to comprehend. "After the accident, after I lost Sabine and Elka, I thought about ending it. Not just the ranch, not just the money, everything." The confession struck Elowen like a blow. "I couldn't see the point of going on," he continued. in a world where the people I loved most were gone because of my mistakes. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. She had known he was haunted by loss, but she hadn't understood how close he'd come to surrendering entirely, or how narrow the line had been between survival and oblivion. "What stopped you?" Ella and Dre asked softly. "Time, mostly," Cale Rook said, and the slow realization that destroying myself wouldn't bring them back, or undo what I'd done. But I couldn't figure out how to live with the guilt of having so much, when my carelessness cost them everything. He turned toward her, his face stripped of defenses, honesty laid bare. The trust wasn't charity. It was my way of making sure my being alive still meant something. Tears burned at Elowen's eyes as the truth settled into place. Not just the money, not just the rescue of a ranch, but an offering far deeper than either. "And then you found me," she said, the last pieces aligning. "I found a woman fighting to hold on to something precious against impossible odds," Cale answered. "Someone who reminded me there are things worth saving, worth fighting for." His voice fell to a near whisper. "Someone who taught me how to hope again." Before she could reply, the low growl of an engine cut through the morning. Tires crunched over packed snow. Car doors slammed. Urgent voices called her name. Through the barn door, Elowen saw Fenna Crow hurrying across the yard toward a black sedan that had somehow forced its way through the storm-choked roads. "Elowen," called a voice she recognized at once. Doc Thayer Holt. Kyle moved to her side instantly, his hand settling at the small of her back in a familiar, grounding gesture. Together, they walked out of the barn toward the gathering near the house. Doc Holt stood beside his car, his expression grave. Behind him stepped a man in an expensive overcoat, his posture crisp with official authority. Fenna wrung her hands, pale and anxious. "Elowen." "Doctor," Elowen said, her heart racing. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "As far as I can tell, the baby's fine," Doc Holt replied carefully, the measured tone tightening her stomach. "But we have a situation that needs immediate attention." The man in the overcoat stepped forward and revealed a badge pinned to his lapel. "Mrs. Dre," he said. "Marshal Enoch Price, Department of Agriculture." Cale stiffened beside her, his entire frame shifting into alert readiness. "I'm afraid we have a serious concern regarding your cattle operation," Price continued, opening the folder in his hands. His voice was calm. Too calm. "We've received reports of diseased animals on this property. Specifically, suspected cases of foot and mouth disease among the cattle you're boarding for other ranches." The word struck Elowen like a hammer. Her breath vanished. "That's not possible," Cale said flatly, certainty ringing in his voice. "I've been with those animals every day. There are no signs of foot and mouth or any communicable disease." "Nevertheless," Price replied, "protocol requires immediate quarantine. No livestock may leave the property. Federal stock ward veterinarians will inspect all cattle within 48 hours. The world tilted. Even if the herd proved healthy, the quarantine alone would shatter the boarding agreements, the very foundation of the ranch's future. Elowen felt the cold creep inward as the scope of the threat became clear. The ranchers who had trusted her with their cattle would be ruined if even a hint of disease proved real. And if the animals were destroyed, her name, still fragile, still new, would be finished before it ever had a chance to mean anything. "Who made the report?" Elowen Dre asked, though dread coiled in her chest as she spoke. Marshal Enoch Price glanced down at his folder, his expression carefully blank. I'm not authorized to disclose the source. I can tell you only this. It came from someone with detailed knowledge of your operation and the specific cattle involved. As he spoke, Elowen became aware of a deep, burning ache low in her back. A tightening swept across her belly, sharper than anything she'd felt before. She had dismissed the earlier discomfort as stress, but this was different. The pressure built again, insistent, undeniable. She lifted her gaze to Cale Rook and saw the truth reflected in his eyes before either of them spoke it. The baby was coming. Now. At the worst possible moment. Doctor, she said quietly, her hand moving to her belly as another contraction seized her. I think you're going to be needed for more than cattle disease today. What followed blurred into a rush of competing emergencies. Contractions came hard and fast, as if the child inside her had chosen this moment, this chaos, to enter the world. At the same time, Marshal Price established a makeshift command post in the barn, coordinating with federal stock ward veterinarians who were forcing their way toward the ranch despite storm-damaged roads. Cale moved between crises with remarkable control, his calm never wavering as he balanced life-and-death decisions on both fronts. How far apart? Doc Thayer Holt asked, checking his watch while Elowen gripped the edge of the kitchen table and breathed through another surge of pain. 3 minutes, Fenna Crow answered steadily. Been that way for the last hour? Then we're doing this here, the doctor said. Even if the roads were clear, there's no time to get her to town. He turned just as Cale entered the kitchen, snow still clinging to his boots. I need you to help get her upstairs. This baby isn't waiting on anyone. Cale was at Elowen's side instantly. His hands were strong but gentle as he guided her toward the stairs. Easy, he murmured, his voice low and steady. One step at a time. In the bedroom that had once belonged to Elowen and Orlin Dre, Fenna was already at work. Clean sheets, hot water, towels, and medical supplies were laid out with efficient precision, transforming the familiar room into something that felt closer to a frontier infirmary than a home. The federal vets have started their exams, Cale reported as he helped Elowen onto the bed. They'll work through the night if they have to. Another contraction tore through her, stronger, deeper, and Elowen reached for him without thinking. Cale's fingers closed around hers at once, firm and anchoring. Who would do this? She gasped when the pain eased, fear cutting through exhaustion. Who would report us now? Cale didn't answer right away, but his jaw tightened. A silent promise that whoever had set this in motion would not remain hidden for long. Someone who knew our operation well enough to make it sound legitimate. Cale Rook said, his voice low, controlled, edged with anger he was keeping on a tight leash. Someone who's been watching, close enough to know about the boarding contracts and exactly which cattle are here. Whoever it is wanted to hit us where it would hurt most, our reputation, our future. Before Elowen Dre could answer, another contraction tore through her with crushing force, stealing the air from her lungs. Everything else, quarantine, accusations, betrayal, vanished beneath the raw, undeniable truth of what her body was doing now. Doc Thayer Holt moved with practiced urgency, checking her progress and murmuring instructions to Fenna Crow, who responded with steady efficiency, hands already preparing what would be needed. Outside, the sounds of the federal operation bled into the house. Engines idling, boots crunching in snow, voices calling orders, cattle lowing as they were moved and inspected. The collision of worlds was surreal. Life beginning in the bedroom while the threat of ruin unfolded in the barn. "I can see the head," Doc Holt announced, a note of excitement breaking through his professional calm. "A few more pushes, Elowen. You're almost there." A surge of strength rose up inside her, deeper than muscle or will. It felt as though every prayer ever spoken over this land, every hope tied to the ranch, was flowing through her now. Cale's hand held hers, warm, solid, unshakable. Proof she wasn't alone. "Orlin's firefighting gear." Elowen gasped suddenly, the thought cutting through the pain with startling clarity. "It's in the barn loft. If someone's trying to destroy evidence, they might try to start a fire." Cale's grip tightened. Understanding flashed in his eyes. Orlin Dre had been a volunteer firefighter, and his equipment, hoses, tools, some emergency supplies, was still stored there. "I'll check it as soon as—" "One more push," Doc Holt called sharply. The world narrowed to breath and effort. Elowen drew on strength she didn't know she had. And then, suddenly, the room filled with a thin, piercing cry. "It's a girl," Doc Holt announced, joy warming his voice. "And she's beautiful." Tears blurred Elowen's vision as she looked at Cale and saw her own wonder mirrored in his storm-gray eyes. Whatever waited beyond this moment, danger, accusations, hard truths, this victory belonged to them. The baby's cry rang through the farmhouse like a promise. Elowen held her daughter for the first time, stunned by the weight of her, by the tiny fingers curling instinctively against her skin, by the way the infant's eyes seemed to search her face with fierce intensity. "She's perfect," Fenna whispered, tears streaking down her weathered cheeks as she looked at the newest member of their unlikely family. "Absolutely perfect." Doc Holt finished his examination with quiet satisfaction. 8 pounds, 2 ounces. Healthy as can be. He smiled. "She's going to be a strong one, just like her mother." Cale stood near the bed, awe written across his face, mingled with protectiveness and something deeper, something that tightened Elowen's chest when their eyes met. In that look, she recognized the same change she felt in herself. Nothing would ever be the same again. The certainty struck her all at once, that everything had shifted, irrevocably. This tiny life in her arms had bound them together, turning loss and chance into something that looked dangerously like a family. Logic and convention no longer mattered. Then the peace shattered. Shouts erupted outside, sharp and urgent, followed by the unmistakable bite of smoke. The smell hit the room like a warning bell. Someone screamed, "Fire!" And through the bedroom window, Elowen saw the orange glare clawing at the night. Cale was moving before anyone else fully grasped what was happening. Training and instinct took over, his mind snapping into order amid chaos. "The barn," he said grimly. "Someone set the barn on fire." The words landed like a blow. The cattle were sheltered in and around that structure. The winter feed was stacked inside, and in the loft, Orlin's firefighting equipment. Once the flames reached the hay, everything would go up in minutes. "If we lose the barn," Elowen's voice broke. "You have to save them," she said, the words more plea than instruction. "The cattle, the equipment, everything." "I will," Cale replied, his voice steady with a certainty that cut through her fear. "But you stay here. You keep the baby safe, no matter what." He stepped to the bed and pressed a kiss to Elowen's forehead, gentle, grounding, then lowered his head to touch his lips to the crown of the baby's dark hair. "I love you both," he said quietly. as if the words had been waiting for this moment. Then he was gone. His boots thundered down the stairs and out into the night. From the window, Elowen watched him sprint toward the barn, the flames painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. He ran with the focused determination of a man who had faced death before and refused to flinch now. Outside, federal agents and federal stock ward veterinarians scrambled to move cattle away from the growing inferno, shouting commands, cutting lines, driving animals through smoke and snow. But the fire was winning, spreading faster than they could clear the livestock. Then Cale vanished into the barn itself, straight toward the ladder leading to the loft. Elowen's heart seized. She knew exactly what he was doing, going for Orlin's equipment. Going into a burning building already thick with smoke, betting his life on the chance it might give them a fighting edge. "He's going for the gear," Fenna Crow whispered, her face tight with terror. "That man's going to get himself killed trying to save this place." But Elowen understood. This wasn't only about a barn, or cattle, or land. It was about choosing to stand when destruction came calling, about proving that love and loyalty could still mean something in a world that kept taking everything away. Minutes dragged like hours as they watched the fire rage and the figures below fight it. Then, through smoke and sparks, Cale reappeared, hauling Orlean's equipment with him. He began issuing orders, his voice cutting through panic with natural authority. Men listened. They moved. They followed. Against all reason, the tide began to turn. The flames slowed. Then they were pushed back. Then, inch by inch, beaten down by exhaustion, coordination, and sheer refusal to surrender. They fought until their arms shook and their lungs burned, until night finally loosened its grip on the valley. When dawn broke, pale and cold, the barn still stood, scarred, blackened, but standing. The cattle were alive. The feed was saved. And Cale Rook stood in the yard, covered in soot and ash, exhaustion etched into every line of his body. But alive. "He did it," Elowen whispered, looking down at her sleeping daughter, then back at the man who had risked everything for them. He actually did it. 6 months later, spring had returned to Willowridge Valley with a quiet generosity that made the brutal winter feel like a story told long ago. The ranch carried the marks of survival. New fence posts standing straight where storms had torn the old ones away. A rebuilt stretch of barn still faintly darker where fire had once clawed at the wood, and pastures flushing green with the promise of another strong season. Elowen stood on the front porch with Vale Dre asleep against her chest, the baby's weight familiar and grounding. She watched Cale Rook working in the yard with a handful of young men who had come to learn from him. His reputation had spread farther than she ever expected. The boarding operation hadn't merely recovered from the false disease report, which investigators later traced to a bitter rival and prosecuted. It had grown into something solid and respected. The morning air was warm enough that Elowen had left the screen door open. Vale's soft breathing blended with the sounds of the ranch. Boots in dirt, cattle shifting, Keigel's low voice carrying instruction without ever needing to rise. Fenna Crow stepped out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and settled into the rocking chair that Orlin Dre had once built by hand. "That man of yours is building quite a name," Fenna said, nodding toward Cale as he demonstrated proper cattle handling. 3 ranchers called this week alone, wanting to send their boys here to learn. Elowen smiled, watching the way the young men leaned in, listening. Cale taught the way he worked. Steady, patient, explaining not just what to do, but why it mattered. After the fire, word had spread fast about how he'd saved livestock and buildings, with calm thinking and hard-earned skill. Now the ranch was becoming known as a place where the next generation learned responsibility as much as technique. "He's good with them," Elowen said. "Reminds me of how Orlin used to handle the seasonal hands, always teaching, never rushing." The memory no longer cut like it once had. Orlin remained part of her life, the foundation beneath everything she'd built since. Loving again hadn't erased him. It had simply added another layer to the life he'd helped start. Vale stirred, letting out a small sound that meant she was waking. At 6 months, she already showed a stubborn spark and a sharp curiosity, balanced by a calm steadiness Elowen liked to believe came from growing up around Cale's quiet presence. Fenna smiled knowingly. "Speaking of that man of yours, have you set a date yet?" Warmth crept into Elowen's cheeks. The engagement had happened 3 months earlier, quietly, without spectacle. Just honest words spoken at dusk, and a promise made without hesitation. "October," Elowen said, shifting Vale to her shoulder as the baby rooted for her next feeding. "We thought it felt right." "On the anniversary," Fenna said, pleased. "A year since the auction." Elowen nodded, watching Cale laugh at something one of the boys said. A year ago, neither of them could have imagined standing here now, on land restored, with a child between them, and a future that finally felt earned. Her tone carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched a careful plan unfold just as it should. It was strange to think how much life could shift in a single year. Elowen felt it deeply as she looked out over the busy yard and the man who had become the steady center of her world. 12 months earlier, she had been a grieving widow on the edge of losing everything that mattered to her. Now she stood rooted in a family that had grown the honest way. Through shared labor, earned trust, and a love that took its time, but proved impossible to shake once it settled in. Cale Rook glanced up from his instruction, meeting her gaze across the yard. The smile they exchanged held the weight of every trial they had survived together. He lifted a hand in greeting, and Elowen answered with a small wave, noticing how the young men around him followed his eyes with quiet respect, as if they sensed they were witnessing something rare. "He's heading this way," Fenna Crow said, already collecting the coffee cups with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew when to disappear. "I'll start on supper." Cale crossed the yard with the easy stride of a man fully at home in his own life. His boots were clean despite the morning's work, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms marked by honest labor. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Elowen and Vale Dre, with an expression that still made her breath catch. "How are my girls?" he asked, the warmth in his voice both familiar and powerful. "Perfect," Elowen said, without hesitation. "Absolutely perfect." Inside the house, a new family photograph rested on the mantel, Elowen, Cale, and baby Vale, captured in a moment of unguarded happiness. It stood among older pictures that told the long story of the ranch, not replacing the past, but adding to it, layer by layer. As Cale climbed the steps to join them, Elowen looked out across the valley that had become their shared home. What they had built here was real, earned from hardship, shaped by loss, and strengthened by choice. The future stretched wide in front of them, uncertain but full of promise. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elowen felt ready to meet it head on. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.